Welcome class 702. We are continuing our video lectures today with feminism, and who better to tell you about feminism than a white middle-class male. So if we were in class, this is the part where you guys would all laugh. But I will make an attempt to teach you guys a little bit about feminism and the feminist ideas and how they relate to therapy and counseling. Feminism kind of arrived as a collaborative effort. Some of the pioneers in the field were Jean Miller, Caroline Enns, Olivia Espin, and Laura Brown White. Once again, it was group work that kind of compiled upon each other. Obviously, this was attached to a lot of the social movements. Obviously, there was a lot of interest in law and the legality of things and how that interplayed with this revolution, really. I guess you could say that it began with women's suffrage and still continues on to this day. It would be naive to say that everything is equal. I think that we know that it is not equal, and the feminists of the world are doing their duty to make sure that that we eventually will become equal, hopefully, if that's possible. So what do we look at when we look at feminism, and how is it related to therapy? I would argue that it would be hard, and I'm sure there's someone that would argue with me, but that it would be hard to just be a feminist therapist. I feel like feminist ideas have their place within therapy. I'm just not completely convinced that you can only be a feminist therapist and only talk about these things and still address some of the other issues. That being said, there are a number of things that are very important to kind of bring up as kind of an alternative view to kind of the male focal point view. Obviously, everything that we've talked about thus far has kind of been created by old white men. And, this is starting to kind of splinter from that a little bit, and there's a lot of value in some of these alternative or just opposite ideas. And oftentimes these things of value are overlooked or ignored because they fall under the feminine headline. So we are going to look at some of those things. So what are we looking at? The number one things that we're looking at is we're looking at gender and power and the relationship between gender and power. Obviously, we're looking at inequalities and we're looking at equalities. We need to consider the social, cultural, and political context of a person presenting a problem. Once again, it is essential to consider the social, cultural, and political context of a person presenting us with a problem. Every one of us comes from a unique background. Obviously, someone from New York City would be different from someone from China, would be different from someone from Mexico. Would be different from someone who's rich, would be different from someone who's poor. And all of these backgrounds kind of come into play. And we need to understand how some of these backgrounds affect the client. And why would sex and gender be any different from that? Being a certain sex is a factor, being a certain gender is a factor that we live with. Oftentimes we live with this unconsciously. But because I am a male, I live a certain way and society treats me a certain way. For you females out there, it's the same thing. There are things that are imposed or expected of you that may be fair or unfair. And what we do with the feminist perspective is we look at these things, we observe these things, all these things that were unconscious before, we bring them up to consciousness. And we talk about how they influence our lives and whether or not that's right and fair and if there's anything that we can do about it. As a feminist, we look at psychological oppression, some of the constraints imposed to us for being the particular gender that we choose. And this goes both ways. This is not just a female thing. There are things that are imposed upon us as men that may not be considered fair, for example. And we'll talk about some of those examples as we go on. We talk about the roles that men and women have in society. What are they expected to do? What is the norms for some of these roles? What does a man do? What does a woman do? Women stay home and they take care of the house and they hike out babies, and they're always there for their husbands. And husbands have a job and they need to always provide, and that's very stereotypical roles that that affect us, that are still present in today's world, and carry some weight. And we decide whether or not that helps us, that works with us, if it's something that we want to include in our world, or if it's something that we want to destroy. We need to bring this understanding into context. We need to kind of realize where we are, what year it is, what state we're in, what country we're in, what is the social, political, cultural context of all these things, so that we have a better understanding of how being a certain gender or sex affects our lives. We are interested in the socialization of men and women. We are interested in how we learn to be a man, or how we learn to be a woman, and how it starts very early. For example, how when you are a girl and you're 3, you get a doll, and as a male, I get a ball. And how all of culture socializes us to kind of be these certain things, and how, for my 8-year-old birthday, I probably would not end up getting a pink tutu, but yet that would not be uncommon for a little girl to receive. And of course, through that, we look at identity development, we look at self-concepts, ideas of ourself, we look at our goals and our aspirations, and we look at some of those other things. We talk about how socialization requires women to give away their power. There's a popular belief, I'm sure there's elements of truth to this, where women are kind of, I guess you could say, put down for being assertive and authoritative, and some of these things that are traditionally male qualities, and how they're kind of forced to kind of fall into those typical roles of a female, which say that I'm going to kind of sit in the background, and I'm going to kind of maybe whisper in the ear of the man to kind of take it from here. And that's obviously something that's very concerning to the feminists. They feel like power has kind of been stripped of the females, and that is unjust, and it's one of their duties to correct this matter. They say that we need to start looking at things through a female lens as opposed to a male lens. Like I said before, many of the theories that we've discussed thus far have been written by old white men. That is a fact. What does it mean to look at life through a female lens? I can make stabs at this, but I'm sure many of you viewers are better at this than I would be. But the ideas of putting value into traditional female things as opposed to male things, to give females an equal voice, and to kind of allow them the 50% that they deserve, being 50% of this planet. I think we can all be honest in saying that this world is not run 50-50. That if we look at our power sources, that it's very unequal. That even within our own government, it's not 50-50. Within other positions of power, it's not 50-50. And we want to challenge this patriarchal system as a feminist. So it's not just enough to be aware of it. We also want to kind of take arms and take action against this, and realize that it's a system that's been built by males and for males. And basically say that it's not okay. By the way, one of the first feminists was Alfred Adler. He was kind of looking at roles and gender, and was one of the first to kind of recognize some of these big themes and bring attention to them. You can see how some of these things would be connected to race and ethnicity, socioeconomic classes, and sexual orientation. some of these same ideas and awareness that we're trying to bring up, it can easily be applied to those as well. This definitely spills into some of the multicultural concepts that we're going to be talking about in the future. This is certainly something that would identify with gay rights and some of those other social movements, where you're basically recognizing human rights that are oftentimes overlooked or just not given the attention that they deserve.